1856, Ohio. The frontier was a place of promise, fertile land, fresh air, and endless opportunity for those willing to tame it. But in the shadows of this wilderness, not every family sought peace. Some carried with them secrets darker than the soil they tilled. Among the settlers came the Graysons. To neighbors they appeared humble and devout. Ezekiel, the stern but charismatic patriarch, Constance, a woman of soft words and healing remedies, and their eldest son Jonas, strong and loyal, always watching. They spoke often of faith, their Bible worn from use, their prayers loud and clear. To weary travelers, their home seemed a sanctuary, a beacon of charity in a land where kindness was rare. Yet, behind the smiles and scripture, the Graysons hid something unholy. Strange whispers surrounded their farm. Families that passed through often vanished, their wagons never seen again. The woods near their land carried a silence too heavy, as if the trees themselves held a dreadful secret. To the world, they were saviors. But history would remember them as something else entirely, predators cloaked in the garments of piety. To the outside world, the Grayson homestead was the very picture of devotion and hospitality. Their small wooden chapel stood at the edge of their property, a simple structure with a hand-carved cross that Ezekiel himself had erected. On Sundays, neighbors would gather there, listening to his booming sermons that spoke of faith, humility, and the trials of the frontier. He had a way of commanding a room, his voice both stern and reassuring, a shepherd guiding lost souls. Constance, his wife, was known as a healer. Her hands worked with herbs, poultices, and teas that seemed to cure everything from fevers to snake bites. Women in the nearby settlement swore by her remedies, whispering that her knowledge was a gift from God himself. She always smiled kindly, her voice soft, her eyes patient. To those who sought her aid, she was a saint. And then there was Jonas, their eldest son. Tall, broad-shouldered, dutiful. He was the silent guardian of the family, plowing the fields by day and patrolling the property by night. He rarely spoke, but his steady presence comforted travelers who stopped at their door. Everything about the Graysons suggested trustworthiness. They prayed before every meal, offered shelter to weary wanderers, and opened their home without hesitation. To strangers, they were a rare blessing in a land where most doors stayed locked. But beneath this mask of faith, something else lingered. Ezekiel's sermons grew darker, speaking of sin and sacrifice. Constance's remedies, though healing to some, carried bitter undertones. And Jonas's silent stares often lingered too long, as though weighing the worth of every visitor. Neighbors never questioned them. Who would doubt a family so righteous, so generous, so deeply devoted? The Graysons had built a mask of piety so perfect that even suspicion bowed before it. It was in the autumn of 1857 when the Weatherby family arrived at the Grayson homestead. They were travelers from Pennsylvania, a father, Charles Weatherby, his wife Margaret, and their 2 young children. Exhausted after weeks on the road, they were drawn in by the sight of smoke curling from the Grayson chimney, a promise of warmth and rest. Ezekiel welcomed them with open arms. His booming voice carried across the yard, praising the Lord for delivering guests to his doorstep. Constance hurried forward, gathering the children in her arms, offering bread still warm from her oven. To weary eyes, the Graysons seemed like angels. That night, the Weatherbys dined with their hosts. Ezekiel read scripture before the meal, thanking God for provision. Constance served stew, rich and fragrant, and insisted the children drink her herbal tea to soothe their coughs. The travelers ate gratefully, never suspecting that the very food before them was laced with a bitter powder. Within hours, Margaret fell ill, her stomach racked with pain. Constance pressed her hands to the woman's forehead, murmuring prayers, slipping her another dose of medicine. Charles grew uneasy, He noticed the way Ezekiel's eyes lingered, unblinking, as his wife writhed in pain. He noticed Jonas standing silent in the doorway, arms crossed, watching as if he had seen it all before. By dawn, Margaret was dead. The children cried, and Charles demanded answers, but Ezekiel's voice was thunderous. He declared it the will of God, a plague of the wilderness. Constance prepared a grave with her usual calm, her skirts brushing the earth as though burying travelers was nothing new. Charles was not convinced. He began to sense the truth, that his family had been poisoned, not blessed. That night, as he tried to gather his children and leave, Jonas intercepted him, a heavy hand on his shoulder, a cold glare in his eyes. Charles and his children were never seen again. The Weatherbees had vanished, swallowed by the wilderness, their disappearance explained away by Ezekiel's sermons. Neighbors pitied the poor travelers, never suspecting the real cause. And so the Graysons' bloody legacy began. One family lost to history, their fate hidden beneath scripture and soil. After the Weatherbees, the Graysons learned to move more carefully. Their first crime had been messy, nearly exposed by Charles's suspicion. Ezekiel knew that if they were to continue, they had to master the art of deception. What began as a desperate act soon became a ritual, one cloaked in scripture, discipline, and silence. Travelers were always the easiest prey. The frontier roads were long and unforgiving. Wagons often broke down, horses grew lame, and supplies ran short. When weary souls stumbled upon the Grayson farm, they saw only salvation. Ezekiel welcomed them with booming prayers, Constance soothed them with gentle remedies, and Jonas stood watchful, a silent reassurance that all was safe. But beneath this warmth, every detail had been rehearsed. Constance's teas and stews carried subtle powders, herbs mixed with poison so carefully measured that symptoms appeared natural, even divine. A fever here, a seizure there, always explained away as God's test of faith. If death followed, Ezekiel was quick to declare it destiny. He performed graveside sermons with such authority that few dared to question him. Jonas played his part well. His silence was no longer hesitation. It was discipline. He disposed of wagons, scattered belongings in the woods, and ensured that no trace remained. Travelers who vanished along the Grayson path were dismissed as victims of the wilderness. The frontier swallowed families whole every day. Who would suspect the pious Graysons? Their neighbors admired them more than ever. Ezekiel's sermons grew fiery, warning of sin and judgment, his words echoing like thunder through the chapel walls. Constance's reputation as a healer only deepened. No one noticed how many of her patients never fully recovered. Jonas, stoic and tireless, was respected as the model of a dutiful son. Each death made them bolder, each disappearance easier to explain. And soon killing was no longer an accident or necessity. It was purpose. The Graysons had perfected their method. What began as a single tragedy had become a pattern, a design hidden behind scripture, charity, and the silent terror of a family no one dared to doubt. By the spring of 1858, whispers had begun to stir among the neighboring settlements. Too many travelers seemed to vanish after passing through the region. A merchant heading west with goods was never heard from again. A widow with her young son, last seen near the Grayson farm, never reached. Her destination, one by one, names turned into rumors, and rumors hardened into unease. Around hearth fires and in town meetings, people exchanged hushed questions. Did you hear about the Weatherbees? Strange, isn't it? That family from Pennsylvania never made it through. Yet whenever suspicion brushed against the Graysons, it quickly faltered. Ezekiel's sermons were powerful shields, casting every tragedy as God's will or the merciless hand of the frontier. Neighbors trusted them too deeply. Constance was the first called upon when a child fell ill or when a woman needed midwifery. Her remedies worked often enough to earn her sainthood in their eyes, and if a few patients never recovered, that too was fate. Jonas's quiet labor was equally convincing. He plowed endless fields, mended fences, and lent his strength to those in need. Few men worked harder, and none dared accuse him of anything but loyalty to his father and mother. Still, the whispers persisted. Hunters swore the woods near the Grayson land grew too silent, as though animals avoided it. A traveler claimed to have seen Jonas dragging something heavy into the forest at dusk, though he could not say what. Others noted that the Graysons' chapel sermons grew darker each month, with Ezekiel's eyes burning like fire as he thundered about sacrifice and purification. One or two settlers voiced concerns aloud. A man named Harris suggested that perhaps the Graysons knew more than they let on about the disappearances. Within days, Harris's barn mysteriously caught fire, destroying his livelihood. He never again spoke against them. Fear became the Graysons' greatest weapon. To confront them meant risking social exile, or worse, and so the community silenced, its doubts burying suspicions beneath nervous smiles and polite greetings. The Graysons stood untouchable. Their mask of holiness was still firmly in place, but beneath it, the darkness grew deeper, more daring. For the more their neighbors hesitated, the more confident Ezekiel became that his family's path was not only hidden, but divinely ordained. By the winter of 1858, the killings were no longer merely a means of survival. For Ezekiel Grayson, they had become liturgy, a perverse sacrament hidden beneath the cloak of righteousness. It began with his sermons. He spoke of the wilderness as a battlefield of souls, of unseen devils prowling in the night. His congregation, dwindling in number yet bound by fear, listened as he declared that God demanded sacrifice to cleanse the land. At first, his words seemed metaphorical, but within the Grayson household they carried a far more literal weight. Constance became the handmaiden of these rituals. No longer content with her quiet poisons, she crafted elaborate preparations, herbs, ground with bone, broths thickened with blood. She sang hymns as she stirred, her voice soft and trembling, as though each meal was a holy offering. The act of feeding strangers became, for her, a communion with something greater. Whether God or something far darker, none could say. Jonas, too, embraced the transformation. Silent as ever, he obeyed without question, his strength vital to his father's visions. When travelers weakened under Constance's drafts, Jonas carried their bodies with reverence, laying them upon crude wooden altars Ezekiel had built in the barn. There, prayers were spoken not for the victim's salvation, but for the purification of their souls through suffering. The rituals followed a pattern. First came the welcome, bread, salt, and scripture at the Grayson table. Then came the illness, a slow poisoning masked as fate. As the victims weakened, Ezekiel's sermons intensified, his words ringing through the farmhouse like thunder. And when death drew near, the family gathered by candlelight. The victims' final breaths became part of the rite, Ezekiel proclaiming judgment, Constance whispering psalms, Jonas ensuring silence. When it was done, they buried the bodies deep in the earth, marking the graves with crude wooden crosses. To any passerby, the yard resembled that of a devout family honoring the dead. But in truth, each cross marked another secret offering, another piece of the Graysons' bloody covenant. Neighbors saw only the surface. They marveled at the family's piety, impressed by the small graveyard that testified to their compassion for travelers lost on the road. None dared wonder why so many souls perished at their doorstep. Ezekiel believed himself chosen. In his fevered mind, the killings were no longer crimes but obedience to divine will. Each ritual confirmed his conviction that the Graysons had been set apart, not cursed but blessed, to judge, to cleanse, to purge. And so the blood continued to flow, hidden beneath hymns and prayers, sanctified by madness. What had begun as desperation had become doctrine, a faith written not in Scripture, but in the flesh and bones of the innocent. In the summer of 1859, a boy named Samuel Turner came to live with his uncle on a neighboring farm. He was only 12, sharp-eyed and restless, forever wandering through the woods that bordered the Grayson property. Unlike the adults who lived in cautious awe of Ezekiel's family, Samuel was too young to fear them properly. His curiosity was untempered, and curiosity, as it often does, became dangerous. One evening, while chasing a stray dog through the forest, Samuel stumbled upon a clearing behind the Grayson farm. There, half hidden by brambles, he saw Jonas digging in the earth. At first, the boy thought it was just another farm chore, but as he crept closer, he noticed the outline of a body, a pale arm, limp and lifeless, before Jonas quickly covered it with soil. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. He turned and ran, the image seared into his mind. That night, he told his uncle what he had seen, but the man, weary and fearful, silenced him at once. "You speak no such words," he hissed. "Do you want to bring ruin on us all? The Graysons are God's people. Say nothing." Samuel obeyed outwardly, but inside, he could not let it go. Over the weeks that followed, Samuel watched more closely. He noticed how travelers who sought shelter at the Grayson farm never reappeared. He saw Constance carrying bundles wrapped in cloth to the barn late at night. He even caught Ezekiel once in the fields, arms raised, muttering prayers that sounded more like curses. The boy began to draw his own conclusions. The Graysons were not saints, but monsters cloaked in Scripture. And unlike the grown-ups, he was not willing to look away. But Samuel was not as invisible as he thought. Jonas's dark eyes followed him whenever he wandered too near. Constance, too, grew uneasy, her instincts whispering that the boy knew more than he should. Ezekiel, meanwhile, thundered from the pulpit about serpents of doubt and children of rebellion, words that made Samuel shiver, as if the sermons were aimed directly at him. One night, Samuel resolved to act. He crept to the Grayson farm, determined to uncover proof, something he could show others, something undeniable. He slipped into the barn, where the smell of rot and candle wax mingled. What he found froze him in place. Crude altars stained, dark wooden crosses carved with strange symbols, and the faint outline of freshly dug graves just beyond the walls. Before he could escape, Jonas appeared in the doorway. Silent as ever, he stepped forward, blocking the exit. The boy's heart pounded, but Jonas did not seize him. Instead, he studied Samuel with an expression that was unreadable, neither anger nor pity, but something in between. Samuel fled that night, slipping past Jonas and running until his legs gave out. But from that moment forward, the Graysons knew. The child had seen too much. And though the community might silence men, women, even whole families, a child's frightened voice could spread like wildfire. For the first time, the Graysons faced a danger not from strangers, but from one who lived among them. By the autumn of 1859, whispers had begun to stir in Cedar Mills. For years, the townsfolk had chosen blindness over suspicion, accepting the Graysons as pillars of faith. But a child's voice, Samuel Turner's voice, was harder to silence. Children spoke without guile, and though adults dismissed them, the seed of doubt had been planted. Samuel spoke first to other children. He told them of graves hidden behind the Grayson farm, of voices chanting in the night, of Jonas's hollow, eyes watching from the trees. At first they laughed, treating his words as ghost stories. But fear has a way of spreading quickly, especially among the young. Soon mothers noticed their children avoiding the Grayson path, whispering when Ezekiel passed, clutching at their skirts when Constance offered her kind smile. The adults were slower to turn. Ezekiel was too respected. too commanding. His sermons rang with the certainty of a prophet, condemning sin and promising salvation. Still, unease crept in. Why had so many travelers vanished on the Graysons' land? Why did their graveyard grow, while others shrank? Why did no illness ever seem to touch their family when fever and plague claimed others? One evening, a council was called in the back room of the general store. A handful of men gathered. Samuel's uncle, weary and reluctant, the blacksmith whose brother had vanished on a journey through the valley, the school teacher who admitted children had been... Speaking of strange things, they spoke in hushed tones, fearful even behind closed doors. "We cannot accuse them without proof," one man argued. "And what proof would you have us seek?" another shot back. "A child's story." "Sometimes," Samuel's uncle muttered, "a child sees what grown men refuse to." Still, fear kept them from action. The Graysons' influence was too strong, their farm too close, their presence too suffocating. To confront them openly was to invite ruin. Meanwhile, Ezekiel sensed the shift. His sermons grew darker, more accusatory. He thundered against the venom of lies and the children of deceit. His eyes, when they swept over the congregation, seemed to linger on Samuel. And though no name was spoken, everyone felt the target of his fury. Constance, in her way, sought to soothe the unease. She carried bread and broth to neighbors, spoke soft words of comfort, and visited the sick. But even her kindness now seemed uncanny. People whispered that her soups made one weaker, not stronger, that her herbs carried hidden poisons. The very acts that once won trust now sowed suspicion. Jonas, silent and watchful, was seen more often at the edge of town. He lingered by the schoolhouse, his expression unreadable as the children played. The sight of him sent shivers through parents, though none dared confront him. As the year waned, unease hardened into dread. The town could no longer ignore the shadow that hung over the Graysons. Rumors spread like wildfire, of rituals in the barn, of travelers buried in shallow graves, of Ezekiel's fiery prayers summoning not heaven, but hell itself. Yet no one acted. Fear bound their tongues. Fear of God, fear of the Graysons, fear of what might be uncovered if the earth was truly turned. And so Cedar Mills lived in uneasy silence, every man and woman haunted by the same question. Were the Graysons holy or damned? By the winter of 1859, Cedar Mills had become a town divided. Half the people still clung to the Graysons, convinced that their towering piety was a shield against judgment. The other half whispered in secret that Ezekiel's family carried darkness rather than light. The air itself felt heavy with dread, as if the soil knew what the people dared not speak. Samuel Turner, restless and unshaken, became the spark no one wished for. Though his uncle tried to silence him, the boy continued to speak, first to friends, then to anyone who would listen. He described the barn, the graves, the prayers that chilled his bones. Children believed him, women listened, and soon even men began to wonder if the boy's words were not madness but truth. The turning point came when a peddler vanished. He had been seen entering Cedar Mills, pulling a cart of wares, and he had been seen again walking toward the Grayson farm. He was never seen after that. His cart was later found in the woods, broken, abandoned, with no trace of its owner. The town could no longer hide behind silence. Whispers hardened into meetings. Behind shuttered windows, groups of men debated action. The blacksmith called for torches, the school teacher for caution, Samuel for justice. Fear gnawed at every suggestion. Yet so did anger. Too many had disappeared. Too many questions lingered. The Graysons' sermons grew louder, their prayers more desperate, as if they too felt the tide turning against them. Constance was seen less in the village. Her absence unsettled many, as if her careful presence had been the last thread tying the Graysons to humanity. Jonas, however, was everywhere. He watched from alleys, stood in silence outside gatherings, his gaze heavy enough to scatter men into uneasy silence. He spoke not a word, yet his presence was as threatening as Ezekiel's thunder. Then came the night of the blood moon. The sky burned red, and the townsfolk gathered in frightened awe. From the Grayson farm, the sound of chanting carried on the wind, low, fevered, unrelenting. Some swore they heard more than human voices in the dark. Others claimed they saw figures moving against the crimson horizon. That night, Cedar Mills decided. The time for whispers was over. Men sharpened axes, women gathered their children, and the council resolved to act. If the Graysons were holy, God would protect them. If they were damned, then the town would no longer live under their shadow. The reckoning was coming, and as the red light of the moon washed over the town, every heart knew the truth. Something had to break, and soon. The night of the blood moon did not fade quietly. By dawn, Cedar Mills had chosen its course. Men gathered with rifles and axes, women prayed over their children, and Samuel Turner stood among them, small but unflinching. The town would march to the Grayson farm, not in secrecy, but in defiance. For too long, they had lived in the shadow of suspicion. Now they would seek the truth, no matter how dreadful. The Grayson farmhouse loomed at the edge of the woods, its windows dark, its barn door slightly ajar. The townsfolk advanced with torches raised, their footsteps crunching on frost. Silence greeted them. Too much silence. Not even the wind stirred through the trees. Ezekiel appeared first, stepping onto the porch with his Bible clutched to his chest. His eyes burned with fury. "You come as wolves to the Lord's flock," he thundered. "Turn back, lest his wrath consume you." But his words fell flat. The blacksmith stepped forward, voice shaking. "Where is the peddler? Where are the travelers? Where are the children?" No answer came. Only Constance emerged from the shadows, her face pale, her hands stained with something dark. She smiled faintly, almost tenderly, and whispered, "You should not have come." The barn door creaked wider. From within came chanting, low, guttural, and many-voiced. The townsfolk froze as Jonas emerged, carrying a rusted blade, his eyes empty as night. Behind him, shapes moved in the darkness. The missing, or what remained of them. With a cry, the blacksmith hurled his torch into the barn. Flames licked the dry wood, illuminating horrors within, bodies laid in rows, some lifeless, others bound and gagged, their eyes pleading, and at the center, a crude altar, stained deep red. Chaos erupted. Men surged forward, rifles cracking, axes swinging. Ezekiel roared scripture, his voice drowning in the screams until a shot struck him down. Constance wailed, her voice twisting into something inhuman before she too fell beneath the mob's fury. Jonas fought like a beast, cutting down 2 men before a dozen drove him into the fire. His body vanished in the flames, his scream carrying into the woods. The barn burned hot and fast. The chanting ceased. The captives who lived were dragged into the cold air, weeping, broken. The rest were left to the flames. By dawn, the Grayson farm was nothing but ash. Cedar Mills stood together, yet not in triumph. The air smelled of blood and smoke. No one spoke of victory. What they had seen, the altar, the rituals, the Graysons' true face, was too heavy for celebration. They had rooted out evil, yes, but at the cost of innocence, faith, and peace. Samuel Turner watched the ruins with solemn eyes. He had been right, but there was no joy in it. He would grow, the town knew, into a man marked by what he had seen, a prophet not of salvation, but of warning. The Graysons were gone, but their memory lingered. The woods near the old farm stayed silent, as if mourning. Travelers still avoided the valley, and for generations, Parents whispered to their children of the family who prayed to darkness beneath the mask of light. The story of the Graysons became legend, half cautionary tale, half nightmare. But to those who had lived through that night, it was no tale. It was truth, carved into their souls by fire and blood. And so ended the Graysons, not as saints, not as martyrs, but as monsters revealed at last.